They said it was a normal birth and that everything would go well. But what happened inside that white room in Sremska Mitrovica could never be called medicine. Amidst screams, insults, and the cold sound of surgical instruments, a mother went in to give birth and left carrying a pain that time cannot heal. The hospital tried to keep quiet. The city preferred to forget. But now, the truth begins to leak through the walls. It was a winter dawn in the small town of Sremska Mitrovica, Serbia. The wind cut through the deserted streets, and the sound of hurried footsteps echoed between the grey concrete buildings. Marica Mihajlovic, a 30-year-old woman, held her belly with one hand and the medical record with the other. She was in labor. I was scared, but also hopeful. It was her first child. "Everything will be fine," her husband said, as he pushed open the heavy door. City General Hospital. In the reception area, the air was cold and the silence uncomfortable. Nurses paced back and forth, with blank expressions, as if the pain were just routine. Marica tried to smile, but the atmosphere made her feel invisible. She was a woman, Romans, part of a marginalized community, and knew that in that country, that was enough to make her treated like someone who didn't belong there. The clock read 3:27 a.m. when she was taken to the delivery room. The white fluorescent light was blinding. The peeling walls, metal trays, and the smell of disinfectant created a laboratory atmosphere. The doctor on duty, Dr. Marko Maksimovic. He walked in with firm steps without looking at her. He simply asked curtly, "How many children have you lost?" Marica replied, startled, "None, sir. This is the first." The doctor snorted and ordered her onto the stretcher. Her husband was prevented from entering. "No one needs to get in the way," they said. As the contractions intensified, Marica began to cry in pain. She called for help. A nurse responded sarcastically, "If screaming helped, everyone would already be safe." The laughter echoed like blades, and then what was supposed to be the most sacred moment of her life turned into a nightmare. The doctor approached and, according to later testimony, pressed hard on the patient's abdomen, shouting racial slurs, calling her gypsy filth. She felt something snap, a dry internal sound as if something had broken. Between physical pain and shock, Marica tried to breathe, but her breath seemed trapped. The baby was still moving. She asked for a heartbeat. No one answered. The voices grew distant, the cold grew. She felt her blood drain and her body tremble. That's when she realized no one was trying to save her. They were just passing the time until the inevitable end. Hours later, the room fell silent. A doctor who hadn't been involved in the birth entered, glanced quickly at the monitor, and asked, "What about the baby?" One of the nurses replied indifferently, "He didn't make it." No documents were signed at the time. No reports were read. Just one sentence. It was a fatality. When her husband asked what had happened, they said the child was stillborn and the body would be sent for testing. But they didn't say where. Marica, weakened, with a broken riband, a look that mixed pain and disbelief, she could barely speak. All she could repeat was, "He was alive." I heard the crying. Outside, the dawn was breaking coldly over the city, and the hospital continued its usual rhythm as if nothing had happened. But inside that woman, something had changed forever. She knew that what happened wasn't a mistake, it was a crime, and that no matter how hard they tried to erase it, the truth wouldn't stay buried with her son. The next day, the hospital corridor was filled with metallic clangs and hurried footsteps, but no human sound seemed to acknowledge Marica's pain. She woke in an isolated room, her body covered in bruises and her chest throbbing with each breath. When she tried to speak, a nurse placed a finger on her lips and whispered, "Rest. The baby didn't make it. No look of empathy, no explanation, just emptiness. The husband, Stefan, tried to understand what had happened. He knocked on the door of the medical room, demanding information, but was stopped by a security guard. "The doctor is busy. Wait for the report." Hours turned into days. No paperwork, no tests, no proof of birth. The son's name, Nicholas, never appeared in hospital records. When Stefan asked where the body was, he received the coldest answer anyone could give. "It has been sent for forensic analysis. If you'd like, you can fill out a request form." The couple realized something was deeply wrong. The staff avoided eye contact, papers seemed to vanish, and the doctor in charge, Dr. Marko Maksimovic, had simply disappeared. Marica begged to see the baby's body. They said it was impossible. "There's no authorization." She cried, unable to understand. "Permission from whom? He's my son." The answer was silence. Days later, when she was finally discharged, she could barely walk. As she was leaving, an older nurse approached discreetly and whispered, "Don't accept what they say. This wasn't an accident." And she disappeared down the hallway. That phrase echoed in Marica's head like a sentence. From that moment on, fear turned to distrust, and distrust turned to strength. Back at the small house on the outskirts of town, the news spread. Neighbors whispered, some saying it was fate, others that people, like her, shouldn't have gone to a white hospital. But an outraged relative took the case to the local press. It was the beginning of a war Marica didn't want, but one that fate imposed. The hospital reacted quickly. In less than 24 hours, it released an official statement. Complications during delivery resulted in neonatal death. There was no medical error. The statement attempted to bury the case under an avalanche of technical terms, but contradictions began to emerge. The medical records were incomplete, the birth time didn't match the death certificate, and the baby's body had simply disappeared. It was then that an anonymous complaint reached the newsroom of a news portal. "There are cameras in the hospital. The recording of the birth was deleted the same day." Marica felt the ground disappear. It was confirmation that this was not a fatality, but rather a deliberate cover-up. The doctor, known for his aggressive behavior, had been reported before, but the system always protected him. Behind the scenes, the hospital was working to contain the damage. Nurses were instructed to not comment on the incident. The electronic records from that early morning disappeared from the system. Management claimed it had been a server failure. Too much of a coincidence. Even in the midst of her grief, Marica began to memorize everything. Names, times, voices, gestures. Every detail was a piece of the puzzle. She knew that time was running out, and that in cases like this, whoever remains silent out of fear buries the living truth. In the following days, the woman who arrived at the hospital asking for help began her own investigation. And the more she discovered, the more horrific things unfolded. Falsified documents, non-existent tests, and accounts of other mothers who had also left without their babies, and without answers. The first clue came about by chance. Marica was at home trying to gather the strength to report the hospital when a neighbor knocked on the door. She was a middle-aged woman with a tired look and trembling hands. Her name was Yelena. "I saw the report," she said hesitantly. "What happened to you?" "Happened to me, too." Marica froze. For the first time, someone understood her. The two of them sat in the kitchen, steam from the coffee rising between their tears. Yelena said that in 2019 she had lost her baby in the same hospital, under the care of same doctor. The story sounded identical: humiliation, pain, silence. She had also heard her son's cries before receiving the news of the stillbirth. And the body, it was never delivered. The similarity was eerie. They said the baby was taken for an autopsy and that the results would come later, Yelena explained. But they never came. In the following days, Marica began receiving messages from other women, some afraid to identify themselves. They were mothers from the community, Romans, poor, marginalized. Their voices formed a chorus of pain muffled by years of neglect. One wrote, "I was also insulted. They said my son didn't make it, but his body never appeared." Another, "I felt him moving until the end. I can't believe he died." The pattern was too clear to be coincidence. Same doctor, same hospital, same outcome. Local authorities, however, dismissed it all as minority rumors. Institutional bias was so deep that the complaints seemed to disappear before reaching the prosecutor's office. Marica then understood that justice would not come alone. She looked for the ERRC, European Roma Rights Center, an international human rights organization. There, for the first time, someone heard their story without disdain. The lawyers were shocked by the number of medical inconsistencies and similar accounts. They decided to act. A dossier was assembled, names, medical records, statements. It was the beginning of an investigation that promised to shake the Serbian health system. When the news spread to the international media, the hospital reacted with panic. It attempted to sue journalists, threatened staff, and claimed that the patients suffered from post-traumatic delirium. Dr. Marko Maksimovic was removed, but only temporarily. In practice, he continued to visit the hospital. The official silence hid the fear of an indelible stain, the possible existence of a birth manipulation network. Meanwhile, Marica began having recurring nightmares. She dreamed of her son's cries coming from the hallway, the metallic sound of instruments falling to the floor. Sometimes she woke with the sensation of hearing a distant baby. The trauma had become physical. She could barely sleep. But the pain, instead of destroying her, became fuel. "I can't let him die twice," she said, her eyes fixed on an ultrasound photo. Meanwhile, an investigative reporter from TVN1 discovered that the hospital had deleted camera records on other suspicious dates. In at least 4 cases, the mothers reported the same doctor, the same sequence of technical failures, and the same disappearance of bodies. The pattern was statistically impossible, and yet the state remained silent. International pressure was growing. Human rights organizations demanded a federal investigation. But in the heart of Serbia, impunity has long roots. Doctors protect each other, and women's pain, especially poor and Roma women, is treated as a nuisance, not as evidence. However, something has changed. For the first time, fear is no longer greater than revolt. Women began to come together. They formed groups, shared stories, and gathered evidence. And amidst their collective grief, a strength was born that no hospital could extinguish. Marica, now a symbol of resistance, promised herself, "If I don't have justice, no one will believe it exists." And as she spoke, the corridors of Sremska Mitrovica no longer seemed so silent, because every whisper of pain began to turn into a voice. When the complaint officially reached the public prosecutor's office, the mood in Sremska Mitrovica changed. The name of Marica Mihajlovic was no longer just that of a grieving mother. It was that of a woman who had dared to stand up to the system. And in Serbia, that comes at a price. The first few weeks were marked by silence and closed doors. No prosecutor wanted to sign the investigation request. Some claimed lack of evidence. Others simply disappeared from meetings. The documents sent by the Human Rights Organization, more than 200 pages of contradictory testimonies and reports, seemed to be lost in some institutional drawer. It was as if the entire state was trying to pretend nothing had happened. Meanwhile, Marica began receiving anonymous phone calls. Male voices spoke in short, direct sentences. "For your own good, stop this." Another time, someone scratched the word liar on her door. Neighbors, who had previously shown pity, now distanced themselves. Her husband lost his job. The small town turned against them. But she didn't stop. She participated in interviews, traveled to Belgrade with the help of journalists, and told everything on national television. It was there that the entire country heard, for the first time, the details of the horror: racial insults, fractures, disappearance of medical records, and manipulation of exams. The public was divided. Some were outraged. Others, influenced by the hospital's propaganda, called Marica hysterical. Dr. Marko Maksimovic, in turn, hired a renowned lawyer and declared to the press that it was all an attempt to destroy professional reputations. He said the patient was fabricating memories due to emotional shock, and that no baby disappeared, just a mistake in the records. The coldness of his words was proportional to the indifference in his gaze. During her first testimony, Marica had to relive every detail. The judge seemed impatient, the prosecutors distracted. "Do you have proof that the baby was born alive?" the judge asked, without looking up from his papers. She took a deep breath and replied, "I remember his crying, and I remember the moment the sound stopped." The silence in the room was absolute. The following week, 2 nurses decided to testify anonymously. They confirmed the doctor's aggressive behavior, the racist insults, and the sudden disappearance of the records. But the day before the hearing, one of them withdrew her testimony, citing internal pressure. The other disappeared. Literally, she was never seen working at the hospital again. The international press began calling the case the birth of silence, and social media exploded with support. Thousands of messages called for justice, comparing the case to past scandals, missing babies in Serbia in the 80s and 90s, when hundreds of poor families claimed their children were presumed dead and illegally sold. The echoes of this dark past now resurfaced. Under international pressure, the public prosecutor's office finally opened criminal proceedings against the doctor for gross negligence, torture, and ill treatment. It was the first case of its kind to reach Serbian courts based on allegations of obstetric violence and institutional racism. But behind the scenes, fear persisted. Victims were called in for humiliating interrogations, as if they were the criminals. At each hearing, the hospital's lawyer tried to turn their pain into a lie. "These women want fame," he would say. Marica, sitting on the witness stand, was no longer trembling. The woman who had come to the hospital asking for help now faced the man who had destroyed her life and said firmly, "My son is dead, but the truth lives on, and you will never sleep in peace again." The Sremska Mitrovica courthouse was packed on the first day of the hearing. Mothers, activists, and journalists filled the benches, while the accused doctor stared coldly and expressionlessly at the ground. Outside, protesters held signs with slogans in Serbian. "Justice bleeds!" and "Mothers don't lie." The air was heavy, charged, with expectation and fear. It was the first time a public hospital in the country would be judged by obstetric violence resulting in death. Marica entered the courtroom with a firm step, but her heart was racing. She was dressed in black. Her lawyer, from the international organization that had taken on the case, asked for silence. "Today, we're not just trying one man, but an entire system that has become accustomed to treating pain as routine." On the other side, the defense attorney responded, sarcastically, "Let's remember that medicine isn't an exact science. Tragedies happen." The judge watched silently, as if holding a bomb ready to explode. During cross-examination, Dr. Marko Maksimovic remained calm. He denied all accusations. He said that Marica did not cooperate during the birth and that the fractures could have occurred due to the patient's incorrect body position. The coldness with which he described the pain of others caused the audience to murmur. When the prosecutor questioned him about the deleted camera records, the doctor replied, "System failure. It happens." No regret, no emotion, just the arrogance of someone who always believed he was above the law. But that day, one witness changed everything. A retired nurse named Vesna asked for police protection and declared before the court, "I was there. He insulted her. He said a gypsy shouldn't give birth in a white hospital. He hit her. I heard the crack. The baby was born alive. He cried. Then the sound stopped." The room fell silent. Marica burst into tears. The defense attorney shouted that it was a lie, that Vesna suffered from dementia. But she firmly replied, "Dementia is pretending it didn't happen." That sentence became national headlines. After the testimony, the hospital was forced to release some of its internal documents. And that's when the ghosts emerged. Doctored reports, forged signatures, duplicated medical records. Everything pointed to a medical administrative cover-up network that went far beyond a single birth. One of the files mentioned similar incidents since 2017, all filed under unavoidable failures. The judge adjourned the hearing and ordered a digital forensic examination. When the experts analyzed the hospital system, they discovered something even more sinister. The camera recordings had been manually erased minutes after Marica's birth. And the login used for this was the doctor's own. The news hit like a bombshell. The streets of Belgrade filled with protests, and the case spread across borders. The UN and the European Union demanded an independent investigation. For the first time, the Serbian government was forced to publicly acknowledge the severity of obstetric violence in the country. But for Marica, none of this brought comfort. She dreamed every night of her lost son and the muffled sound of the hospital machines. The trial gave her hope, but it also reopened wounds. Once, in a press interview, she said, "They think I want revenge. I don't. I don't want anyone else to go through this. I want the hospital where my son died to stop being a cemetery for mothers." The case remained in court for months. With each hearing, new victims emerged. Some said they had been threatened. Others said they had lost children under identical circumstances. What had previously been an isolated tragedy was beginning to reveal itself as a pattern of systematic cruelty. Later that year, the court announced that the doctor would face formal charges for manslaughter, torture, and ethnic discrimination. The sentence was still a long way off, but the silence had been broken. For the first time in decades, women in Serbia realized they could and should speak out. And while newspapers reported on the progress of justice, something much more profound was happening. Society began to see the hospital not only as a place of healing, but also as a stage for abuse and power. A reminder that evil sometimes wears a white coat. The final day of the trial arrived in the pouring rain. The streets of Sremska Mitrovica were lined with cameras, posters, and voices echoing an ancient cry, "Justice for mothers." Inside the courtroom, the air felt thicker than ever. Marica sat in the front row, clutching a small white handkerchief, the same one she'd used during the birth. It was the only object left from that night. The judge read the verdict in a firm voice, guilty of gross negligence and ethnic discrimination, acquitted of the charge of intentional homicide. A piercing silence filled the room. Was it victory? Perhaps, but it wasn't complete justice. The doctor received 3 years in prison, a sentence that could be converted to probation. The sentence seemed small compared to the horror experienced. Still, it was the first conviction for obstetric violence in the history of Serbia. A milestone. Marica wept, not from relief, but from awareness. 3 years? And my son?" she murmured. The lawyer placed his hand on her shoulder and said, "Today you opened the door for everyone else." Outside, journalists surrounded the courtroom, capturing every tear, every word. The headline that spread around the world read, "Roma woman wins landmark case against Serbian hospital." In the following months, other victims began speaking out. Fear gave way to courage. The Serbian parliament announced new legislation against obstetric violence and hospital discrimination, demanding mandatory recordings and public reporting of emergency births. Medical universities began discussing professional ethics like never before. And amidst all this, Marica Mihajlovic's name became a symbol of resistance. But the victory came at a price. Her husband, exhausted from the exposure, left. The family was divided. Her mental health was shaken. Still, Marica remained steadfast, participating in campaigns, lectures, and programs on women's rights. "If my story saves just one life, it was worth what I lost," she said. In one of her last interviews, she returned to the hospital, now renovated and under new management. She walked to the hallway where it all happened. The walls were painted, the lights were new, but the silence remained the same. "Here they took from me what I loved most, but they also gave me a purpose," she said, her eyes welling up. She placed the white handkerchief on a chair and left. No doctor dared to look her in the eye. Marica's case revealed something much bigger than a medical crime. It showed how power, prejudice, and disregard can hide under the guise of authority, how the fear of reporting perpetuates entire systems of impunity, and how a woman's body, when silenced, can become a battleground between humanity and barbarism. Today, her name is cited in similar cases in court. Her testimony has become an international symbol of the fight against medical negligence and institutional racism. She herself says, "I don't seek revenge, I seek a voice, because silence is the real killer." And this is the lesson learned. May no mother need to beg for respect inside a hospital. May medicine never again be an excuse for cruelty. And may each stifled scream, like Marica's, become an echo until a woman's pain should be treated with the same urgency as a heartbeat about to stop.